I was traveling around Southeast Asia actually, and that was when I kind of, in the UK we are not really exposed to the meat or like the animals behind the meat that we get at the supermarket. And when I was in Southeast Asia, I don't know, it's a bit more culturally, the processes behind our food are more open and more visible to us. And I started to see kind of the animals more. And then when I was kind of walking around the streets and you'd see the food out kind of on the side of the road being sold. And I don't know, it just didn't appeal to me as much anymore. So I was cutting out meat more and more. And then I started to eat out with some vegan friends, and we were going to these amazing restaurants and everything was totally vegan. And I just had this epiphany that I didn't have to miss out on flavour and just that feeling of being full and satisfied by food. And I think that was the main thing that was kind of putting me off wanting to go, like, kind of commit full hog. And then I started learning about the environmental side of things and becoming more aware of how animals are actually treated in our food systems, and just educating myself a little bit more. And I just decided that I wasn't okay with it. So almost overnight, I just decided to go vegan. And I started living on a diet of basically peanut butter and jam sandwiches for lunch every day because I didn't know what else to eat, while I figured out how I could get a bit more nourishment in my diet and have a bit more variation. And yeah, just thought, if it doesn't work out, I can go back. And then I started becoming really invested and learning more about animals in our food system. And I just thought, I don't need to. And 2.5 years later, here I am still eating vegan food and trying to promote the benefits of that for the environment as well.
You mentioned you had some friends around you who were vegan, who were kind of taking you to the restaurants and so on and so forth. Had you been friends with them for a while? Had they been sort of drip feeding you bits of information? Do you think now you look back at it?
They're actually fairly new friends that I'd met since I'd been travelling around, and we were having conversations. In hindsight now, I probably was a little bit, the questions that I asked were probably a little bit aggressive because, we know it now when we meet people who aren't vegans, and they are probably curious about veganism, but almost a little bit scared as well. And probably I came across with my questioning like, oh, but what about this? Like, I was trying to catch them out in a way of like, is veganism not a solution? And they're just giving me amazing answers. And so I was just really fascinated by veganism, and I'd been thinking about vegetarianism for a while and just not really kind of committing to it. And then hearing more from them about the animal side of things and just realizing that we don't have to consume animals. I love animals, and then almost that hypocrisy was kind of shone on me, that I love animals, yet I'm willing to eat them, and I just didn't feel comfortable with it. So eating with them, hearing their stories over a fairly short amount of time, and then learning more as well, educating myself, I guess driven by what they'd been telling me. And I just thought, let's go for it. And if it doesn't work out or I feel poorly, then I can stop. That hasn't been the case. I feel better than ever. And some of my health conditions have cleared up. So I think I actually had a bit of a lactose intolerance, and I had quite severe acne, which has cleared up. And I used to get that really heavy kind of bloated feeling after eating, which I almost never get now. So I think it's just had all round an amazing impact on my life.
Looking back, do you think that their example of in the way in which they treated you when you were asking those questions, do you think that kind of has informed a little bit of how you interact with others who perhaps aren't vegan and asking you the same questions now?
Yeah, I think so. They would just ask me questions as well back, about how I was thinking, and that almost brought out some of the hypocrisy behind what I was thinking around my diet and the way we treat animals in our system. But they were never kind of forceful in kind of saying, this is what you should do. And when it's coming to the app that we've been working on and with Floop, I wanted to show people the impact of food in our diets and the impact it has on the world without saying this is what you need to do. So the app is very much based on science and evidence and showing you what the carbon footprint of the food that you're choosing to eat is, and then providing some alternatives, which just they tend to be vegan. They happen to be vegan because generally vegan food has a lower carbon footprint than eating meat, and so you're just presenting people with the information for them to make their own choices and to make those swaps without them feeling forced or kind of pigeonholed or like that back against the wall. No one likes to feel like that. You like to have that freedom and control over what you're doing. So it's just an education tool.
Well, let's talk about Floop. What was the sort of genesis of the idea, and then how long had you had it in your mind, or was this like something that you had in your mind quite early on?
Yeah. So as I said, I've been traveling around and I'd become a little bit more exposed to how climate is impacting places around the world. And I spent a bit of time in Australia when the wildfires were happening in 2019 that made the global news because they were just so awful and widespread. So climate change was really in my mind. And then COVID obviously happened, and I ended up going back to my hometown, which is in Lincolnshire on the east coast of England. And I was staying there. Now, growing up, I was just surrounded by fields. There's basically not a lot else there in Lincolnshire, just these fields. And you see the farmers, they'd be talking about the weather all the time. All these carriages would be going up and down my street past my house. And I don't know, I just didn't really think anything of it. But when I was back there as an adult and kind of seen a little bit more of the world and how the climate was being affected, and then we had that really nice spring, didn't we? And it was really hot, which was amazing for us in lockdown. But again, hearing the farmers talking, they were thinking about the harvest that was coming and how it was going to impact the food supply, basically, their profits and also the food supply. So I just started becoming fascinated about this idea of how does the weather and our climate affect our food? And also, how does our food that we're eating and we're choosing affect the climate? And I've been thinking about that anyway because of my kind of introduction to veganism. And so I had this idea to come up with, I'd tracked calories and macronutrients in the past, a few years before, and kind of had this idea to do something similar. Well, wouldn't it be cool if you could track the carbon footprint of what you're eating? And then you can start to make those changes to reduce your carbon footprint. And it kind of lingered with me for a while. And I didn't really know if it was something that would be possible. But my friend, who also grew up in the same area, has actually gone on to work in sustainability and do research around sustainable food systems and sustainable development. So we just had a conversation to see, is it something that exists? Is it something that's possible? And we didn't see that there was anything out there at the moment, but there was no reason why we couldn't do it. And she knew some of the science and the methodologies that we could use. So together we decided to come up with a way to bring life cycle assessments, which is the science, into an app with the help of my partner who's got a background in app development. And the three of us, we've brought this data into an app so people can use it on their phones and see the impact of what they're actually eating and choosing at their fingertips. And then hopefully the idea is that we can empower people to make more sustainable food choices, which then in turn creates demand in our food systems for more sustainable food. As we know, we've seen with veganism, the demand and the rise in veganism over the last few years has created an enormous shift in the availability of vegan food products, more sustainable food products. And there's so much power that we have every day in the food that we're buying. When we go to the grocery shop, every single meal, we can vote for that kind of better food system. And our diets is a huge source of our personal carbon footprint, but also the global carbon footprint and the emissions that we put into the atmosphere.
It's an amazing idea. And I'm just curious, like when you first started to think about this, we all obviously know through the documentaries we've seen and the information that we might have read and articles and bits and pieces that, broadly speaking, a plant-based diet is better for the environment. That's the sort of the headline, if you like. Was there kind of any desire from your part to kind of like almost see that for yourself in sort of a data form? And was there anything that kind of surprised you when you looked into it?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd read these broad brush statements and it kind of just didn't satisfy my need to like get into the data. I love getting into the data. And so that when I started looking and trying to do my own research, I just couldn't find it anywhere. There was not one single place where you could just find all of the carbon footprints. There are some calculators, but I wanted it to be on my phone so that I could use it on the go. And when I started talking to other people as well, either they hadn't really considered the environmental impact of your food, like they just weren't aware of it, or they'd heard things, they'd seen the documentaries, they'd read things in newspapers, and again they were just like, I've really got no idea, or they're aware that going vegan was the thing to do, but they weren't quite ready to commit to that full hog. So it's like I suppose there was this feeling that it was an all or nothing, like you have to go vegan or it's nothing else. And I just carry on as I am, which is just absolutely not the case. Like we can all make small changes and it builds up to a massive sustainable change. There's billions of us on the planet. And if we all do one thing every week, that's an enormous change, just from doing one single change a week. So I really wanted to bring that data to the forefront, make it accessible, and just empower people with knowledge, because it's not there at the moment, and that's what we're hoping to do with the app.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it certainly will. Certainly will. As as someone who's been in the sort of vegan community for 2.5 years now, you no doubt have been quizzed, particularly probably when you've talked about this app, around sort of particular things like avocados, bananas. They jump to mind. Avocados, particularly, always feel like the kind of the one that non-vegans will target you with and say, well, all you vegans and your avocados are actually what's causing the problem, even though of course everyone eats avocados, but which is always a fact that's kind of missed out of the discussion. But still, when you looked into some of those particular kind of food sources, did you find that those kind of views were borne out? In broad strokes, should we be looking into things like the locality of our food as well as kind of whether it's vegan or not? Because I think you can sort of feel a little bit complacent, almost like, well, I'm now eating vegan only, but am I doing enough? Is what I'm doing still? Is there a better way still of what I'm doing currently?
Yeah. So the avocado question is really great. I think you're right in that it just kind of it gets a hard time, the avocado, and for good reason. It isn't a very sustainable fruit compared to other fruits that we can have. But I think people will say that we have avocados in place of a steak or something. It's just not true. We don't have an avocado, like it's not replacing meat in any form, anyone's diet, But if we look at meats like in a minced form, if you were having a spaghetti bolognese or something, and then you substitute that for lentils are going to be hugely more sustainable than having beef, and they are way more sustainable. Beef is one of the it is the food that has the highest emissions per kilogram. It's way ahead there. Whereas lentils have a much smaller, then they give a similar texture. You can add things that give them a similar flavour to beef, so you get that same satisfying feeling from the meal that you're having. But just going back to avocados, they are unsustainable as a fruit on the scale that we're growing them, right? So once upon a time, avocados were a luxury. They were something that we had as a treat. We didn't have them kind of every day or available to us every day to be having all the time. And when you look at the carbon footprint of avocados, we often think about the transport, because avocados come from a long way away. They're often grown in places like Mexico, South America. A bit closer to home, it'll be in places like the south of Spain or Portugal. And most of our avocados do come from South American continent. So they're transported a long way, and that obviously has a big impact in terms of air miles, and they're often transported by plane because they degrade quite quickly. So to make sure they're fresh when they get to us, they're travelling by plane, which has a higher carbon footprint than local lorries. But actually, the biggest part of the carbon footprint of most of our foods is when they're actually being farmed. So when they're in the field, and it's the same for avocados. The biggest part of their carbon footprint is from the irrigation, because they're a very thirsty crop. They need a lot of water, and they're growing in water scarce areas where there's not that abundance of fresh water. So there are big irrigation systems to bring that water from one place to another and make sure that the crops have the water that they need to produce the fruit. And that requires a huge amount of energy. And when energy is being when we're using energy, that releases a lot of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so that's where the carbon footprint becomes biggest. And it's the same for locally as well. The carbon footprint is highest in the fields because we have things like the tractors going up and down. There's a lot of time that they're spent in with the tilling of the ground as well. But you're saying, are there the things that we can do to have or to choose a lower carbon footprint? And generally, eating more seasonal food is a really good way to reduce your carbon footprint, because we're eating with the natural resources that are available to us, as we would have done kind of 100 years ago. We would have just eaten what was at their peak. So we're coming into, well, we're in June now, so it's a very good time for having a good variety of fruit and vegetables available. We have like a checklist that we use to, it's like a simple, is this likely to be more sustainable? And is it veggie? Is it seasonal? And is it local? So if you're vegan, like, you've already ticked off the veggie one, that's great. You know that you're pretty much onto a winner, and you're likely to be eating more sustainable food. So the second one is it seasonal? And when we're eating with the seasons, we're using the natural resources that are available to us. So if we look at what we're doing when we're growing out of season, it's kind of easier to understand why seasonal food is so good. So if we're growing something out of season, we are having to create artificial conditions to grow the food. So if we look at tomatoes, for example, if we're growing them out of season, we need to put them in a greenhouse that's being heated. And these greenhouses require, again, huge amounts of energy to bring them up to the heat that the tomatoes need to be able to thrive and to fruit. So if they're not using renewable energy, then they're having a huge carbon footprint again. So if we eat tomatoes when they're in season, we're not using all that energy. We're just using the sun and the natural resources, and we're adding water that's helping that crop to grow. So eating seasonal food is a really good way to reduce the carbon footprint. And just going back to tomatoes a little bit, often our tomatoes are imported. And again, a lot of people think that the transport, the food miles that are involved in that transport are one of the major sources of the carbon footprint. But actually, again, even abroad, we're still growing tomatoes in those greenhouses. And then when it comes to things like canned tomatoes, the carbon footprint goes up even more because of the energy that is involved in heating the tomatoes as they go into cans, the packaging, and then getting them to the supermarket once again. So there's a few different elements to think about in the life cycle.
Wow, that is fascinating. How difficult then? I suppose you do. Your answer is probably going to be, well, you use the Floop app. How kind of like opaque is it for a buyer to find this kind of stuff out as a consumer? Because I mean, I've seen in certain examples. I think M&S did it for a while, where it said like air freighted on, they'd put a sticker on things to kind of highlight that something was air freighted. But I don't see much else in terms of that conversation. And it sounds like really quite nuanced. Like, generally I would have thought, well, if it was grown in the UK, then that's probably better. I should always pick that. But like, you raise a valid point. And actually it reminded me of a of a kids program that I watched with my little boy recently called Down on the Farm, which is on CBeebies. And generally, I don't like watching it because there's a lot of animal agriculture in it. But we pick out the episodes with the fruit and veg in, and we watched one on tomatoes. And the thing that sort of struck me about it was the scale of those greenhouses as well. Like, I think, really naively, and it's probably falling for marketing, I had in my head like this image of, like, you know, the greenhouse in the garden kind of thing, like people kind of pottering around, like picking tomatoes and stuff, and it being quite idyllic. And then seeing it on the scale, it was like, you know, I know we measure everything in football pitches, which is really weird, but it was like, you know, like 50 football pitches big or something, you know, this greenhouse. It was just incredible. And it just made me think I would purely pick the British one. I wouldn't, and think local. But actually I could be worse off there. So how difficult is it for a consumer to find that information out? And is it simply a case of just get the Floop app and it will do it for you?
You know, it's really difficult. It's really difficult. And I think this is why I feel so passionate about this as a topic. It comes back, for me, I think there's just not enough education about food in general. Right from when we were at school, just growing up, our food education, I think, is just lacking. Nutritionally, but also environmentally, and just like the actual processes that go into making our food. Now, I said earlier about that I grew up in Lincolnshire, and I literally grew up next to farms. So I did see some of the process, but still, even I grew up next to farms. I had lots of friends whose parents were involved in agriculture in some way. My dad has a family history of agriculture as well. And I still don't know, what's fully involved and like how much time and effort goes into creating our food. And it was only really when I started, I suppose, having my own house and like my own home and growing herbs in my windowsill, and then thinking about growing some tomatoes myself, that's when you actually start to realize these things need a lot of time and they need a lot of care. A lot of, like, with tomato crops, like, you have to water them kind of every day. You need to make sure they're in the right location to be able to get the sun that they need, bringing them inside if it's going to get too cold, like, so they've got the right temperature. And then when you start to think about the scale, and I suppose it's the same when you start thinking about veganism and the animal agriculture side of things, you think about the scale that we have to produce food and the scale of animal agriculture, and it's quite shocking and overwhelming. So yeah, it's really difficult in a nutshell to find out that information. There is a bit of a shift now towards carbon labelling, which is amazing. So there's some businesses or organisations that are starting to carbon label products alongside their calorie information. So it gives you an idea of whether it's kind of better for the environment or not. And yeah, you mentioned about the labels as well. I think looking at labels is a really good way to start kind of increasing your awareness. So if you're in the supermarket and you're looking, I don't know, at apples, if you're even just thinking about the kind of localness of your apples, you're raising your awareness, even if there are some other nuances to think about. But looking at the origin of apples, if you've got pink ladies are my favourite apples, but I've stopped buying them now because they come from New Zealand. I don't need to import apples from the other side of the world when there's some perfectly good Gala apples, which they taste great. They give me the nutrients that I need, and they're cheaper. So that's great, and they're local. So yeah, looking at the origin is a good way to start thinking about the locality. And then, yeah, just learning about the seasons as well. So if you're not sure what food's in season, we actually have a page on our website that talks about the seasons and what's in season. So you can start to think, oh, well, that's coming into season and I can enjoy that. And that's also going to help reduce your carbon footprint. I think strawberries are a really good example of that. Strawberries, I'm a bit of a strawberry snob now, and I refuse to eat strawberries that are out of season because they just never taste as good. But yeah, like, it's something to get excited about when strawberries are coming into season, and I know when they are, I get excited, and I'm like, I can't wait to have that just sweetness that's not there at any other time of year. So yeah,
How about like the I've got so many questions. Like I'm really fascinated by this subject. Like, how about things like the freezing process? So thinking about fruit there, like, buying frozen fruit that you might pop on top of like porridge or in smoothies or whatever it may be. Is there a benefit to that? I mean, obviously there probably is from a food waste perspective, because obviously you're less likely to waste it if it's frozen. But is the process of like, flash freezing and things like that, do those kind of things weigh up in the kind of carbon discussion?
Yeah, so frozen fruit and vegetables do have a higher carbon footprint because they have to go through that energy intensive freezing process, and then there's that long-term storage. So there's the energy that's produced from refrigeration and freezing, like in the supermarkets, in your own home, in the whole supply chain basically. So there is a higher carbon footprint. Food waste is an interesting point because the food that we waste in all stages of the food chain goes to landfill, or it goes into a system where we're producing a lot of methane. Methane is another greenhouse gas. So food waste is actually a major contributor to climate change as well, because it's creating methane as this byproduct when it breaks down. So if you were to balance that food waste impact with the carbon footprint, if you like. I should maybe clarify, when we talk about carbon footprint with Floop, we're talking about carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's not just carbon dioxide. It includes all greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide equivalents help us to compare the impact of different greenhouse gases. So methane breaks down more quickly in the environment than carbon dioxide does, but while it's in the environment, it has a much higher impact. So carbon dioxide equivalents help us to kind of compare them like for like. So when we talk about carbon footprint, we're talking about carbon dioxide equivalents, which includes methane. So if you look at the carbon footprint of food waste and you look at the carbon footprint of the energy that's involved in freezing, I don't know exactly how they would compare. And I would like to do the research on that and figure out, like, are frozen foods better or worse for carbon footprint than the food waste element? And I don't know off the top of my head, but it's really interesting. And I think there's pros and cons for using frozen food and just kind of eating the fresh, I don't know, raspberries or something that's coming into my head now, fresh raspberries instead of frozen raspberries. So yeah, I'm not sure at the moment, but I would love to find that out, and maybe I'll come back to you with an answer for that at some point.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because the more we've talked about it, the more I sort of am getting a picture of just how nuanced this kind of conversation is, that it's not really quite as simple as, I mean, yes, it is as simple as like veggie, seasonal, local. That's definitely like a really great rule to go by. But even within it, there's nuance, there's discussion to be had. Like another interesting point I thought you raised, and I wonder, and again, like it's unfair of me to ask directly because you might well not be equipped with this kind of answer, but I'm fascinated, like how quickly like the kind of agriculture industry, tomato growers, etc., are switching to renewable sources of energy as well. So, if you've got this massive greenhouse growing tomatoes, are those kind of greenhouses being powered by renewables? Is that something that those industries are interested in? I'm kind of fascinated by that too, because that obviously then that changes the discussion again, because there's an element of, well, if this greenhouse is solar powered, then maybe that changes the equation.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know exact figures and stats on like the rate that we're seeing that shift happening, but there are definitely conversations and there are definitely grant funding to support that. So in Lincolnshire, I know that there's definitely a lot of conversation happening around more renewable farms and grant funding to support that. But as we talked a lot about nuance, and the farming system at the moment is struggling anyway. So they're struggling
Yeah.
we know that obviously Brexit's had a huge impact on the staffing of farms and being able to produce the food. And the farms are working at such small margins. And it's kind of been driven by our supermarkets. We're demanding a lower price. And, we're also in a cost of living crisis. So,
Yeah.
and we need to be able to get food as cheaply as possible from a personal budget perspective. But that has a huge impact on the whole kind of farming supply, and farmers are struggling. And when we have the changing climate, that makes it even more difficult. So there are conversations. I don't know how fast it's happening, but I know it's not just as simple as like, yes, we're going to make all the farms renewable in the next 10 years or so, or that would be amazing. But realistically, there's a lot of other challenges that industry is facing that they're needing to prioritize just to keep themselves afloat. So, yeah, it's really interesting. I think that by changing our consumer demand and learning about it, it can show that we want more sustainable foods, and there's like an incentive. We're gonna support the farms, or we're gonna support the food that is coming more sustainably. So there's an empowerment in that perspective. But yeah, it's very complex, and it'd be great to see government policy making that shift to renewable energies in farming quicker and easier to do.
I'm reminded a little bit of a conversation that I had with a different Alex Lockwood to the one who we were talking about before the podcast, a guy called Dr. Alex Lockwood, who has worked with the Vegan Society on a report called Planting Value in Our Food System, and it's all about this kind of discussion that we're having. Actually, it's all about the idea of what would be the benefits of transitioning to a plant-based food system from an environmental standpoint, from obviously an animal welfare standpoint, from all kinds of different angles. And he remarked on when we were talking about processed foods, he talked about there being a real squeeze on the sort of the farmer within any kind of processed food, whether it be animal based or plant based. In terms of, and the example he used was like, if you take like a vegetable lasagna ready meal, that think about the different components of that, and then each supplier has got to be sort of paid, but then the consumer expects a price for that lasagna to be £3 or £4 or whatever it is, and so the amount that everybody's taking, the percentage of that pie, is really tiny, and it just sort of, obviously we're talking slightly differently apart from the sort of the financials, but from the carbon point of view, have you seen any difference in processed versus fresh? Is there a benefit in one or the other?
Yeah. Again, processed, like with freezing. I mean, frozen foods are processed to a certain degree, but they're not perhaps the ultra processed foods that we're maybe thinking about with like burgers and things like that. But if we take something like a can of baked beans, so beans, they're veggie, they can be grown locally as well. But the whole process of like, you need your tomato sauce, there's sugars and stuff that go into it, there's salt, there's the beans themselves, there's all sorts of ingredients that go into making that process. So like with the margins on financially for the food suppliers, there's a different carbon footprint that comes with each of those different elements. But then that needs to be processed and mixed in giant factories that are powered, the heating that's involved, lots of energy, then the canning and the processing as well. So that all takes a lot of energy to produce the cans, especially if not from a recycled source, and then the heating to seal them. And then there's the transport from the factory. Well, there's transport to getting the ingredients to the factory in the first place, and then there's a transport from the factory to the shop's kind of base, or there's several stages of transport, isn't there? And then getting it to your home from the supermarket itself. So yeah, there's lots of, even if it's veggie, there's still a lot of stages that are involved in processed foods rather than just having a single ingredient. We see there's a lot of benefits to whole food diets from a nutritional standpoint, and really from a nutritional standpoint, and for vegans as well. But and also from cost perspective. But yeah, from a carbon footprint perspective, whole food diet is a really great way to reduce your carbon footprint too, because you're just eating really like the raw kind of ingredients, and you're putting it together yourself rather than in these big factories that require lots of energy to run, basically.
I would imagine that that is a really valid point for kind of vegans thinking about, you know, whether what choices they're making, whether they're going to choose processed, whether they're going to choose fresh. That's like something to really consider. But I'd imagine, and you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd imagine like if we're going to take like a Beyond Meat burger versus a beef burger, I'd imagine that the benefits of it being veggie still outweigh, even with all the processing that may be involved, still outweigh the beef. That's still far and away above. Is that does that bear out in what you've seen in the data?
Yeah, 100%. So as I mentioned earlier, the actual farm is where the majority of our carbon footprint comes from. So if you take I think it's pea protein that makes a lot of a Beyond Burger. So if we look at the impact of growing peas in a field versus the impact of beef, I mean, it's enormous, the divide between those two products. So yeah, even though there's a processing, I mean, it's going to be similar sort of processing, almost comparable in a sense. I know there'll be some differences with having to cook the meat and everything, or process the meat, but yeah, comparable sort of processing, but it's the field of those ingredients where the carbon footprint is reduced. And not just the carbon footprint, the water use, the land use, there's other environmental factors. And with the app, we're focusing on carbon footprint at the moment, but we really want to bring in some of those other factors like water use, particularly for scarce water, like land use, and also some of the social factors as well, so that people just can learn a little bit more about that side of things, the overall environmental impact of our food, because it is nuanced, as we've said. It's not just as simple as saying a lower carbon footprint is better overall for the environment. It's not quite as simple as that, but it's a good starting point. It's a really good starting point. And that's why we've chosen to do it that way. But an example, I suppose, of the carbon footprint is not always a marker that it's great for the environment is in our milks. So if we look at plant-based milks, which all of them have a lower carbon footprint and lower environmental impact than dairy milk. So if you're choosing a plant-based milk, that's a great step forwards. But then within the plant-based milks, we have different environmental impacts. So almond milk, for example, has a really low carbon footprint. I think it actually has the lowest carbon footprint of all of the milks. But almonds are grown in predominantly California. I think that's where most of the almonds for our almond milks are grown, or in places like Spain, in very arid areas, which again need a lot of irrigation systems because these plants need a lot of water to produce the nuts. So lots of irrigation needed in these scarce water areas. And that the plants themselves need a lot of water. So their water use is very high compared to other plant-based milks. So when you look at something like oat milk actually has kind of the best overall, or the lowest overall environmental impact. It has a higher carbon footprint than almond, but it uses less water, it uses less land. And for us in the UK, we can grow oats locally. So we can reduce the food miles involved in that as well. So overall, oat milk is my winner.
It's my winner personally as well. So that is good. yeah, from a flavour point of view. So that is good news. Do you think, like on a sort of a large scale, ultimately we are as a kind of community, as a culture, as society, we're going to need to have probably a serious look at what we consider to be luxury items and so on as we go into the future and we think about food security and overcoming climate change and these kind of things. I just think that I just sort of had that thought when we were talking back about avocados being a luxury and how things have potentially evolved, and we're in an age of We want everything now, and we want everything cheap. And if it's out of season, we will find a way to make it in season for us, so that we've got it. We've got whatever we want whenever we want it. Do you think there needs to be ultimately a bit of a reality check on all of that for all of us as society, as consumers?
Yes, basically, I do, and I don't think it's something that we want to hear. If I'm honest, I don't want to hear it. I want my avocados whenever I want them. But the reality is, if we want to protect the future of our planet, we do need to be thinking about these things and taking action on it, because the global food system is not sustainable as it currently is. From an animal agriculture point of view, it's not sustainable, and there are improvements that we can make from the fruit and veg perspective as well. So yes, it's not something that we want to hear, but it is, I think, a reality. When we look at the history of our food systems, it's really over the last 50, 60 years, really since the 1950s, when this ultra-processed food, the processed foods has really become part of our life, and we've become very, very dependent on it. And that has driven this kind of demand to have ingredients when we want them. But before that, it would have been totally alien to my grandparents to have, when they were growing up, to have had all these foods just available to them whenever they wanted, let alone that they grew up through the Second World War. So there was obviously rations in place. But, as not just the ingredients that we have, but as a society I'm going to focus on the UK and particularly North America, Western Europe really, we overconsume. We don't actually need as much food as what we tend to eat to survive as humans. We have our recommended daily allowances, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of us often eat more than what we need. And every time we eat more than what we need, that is using resources and using food that it essentially is wasted by our bodies. It's not, we're just storing that for later, or as fat, and that's creating a health crisis as well. So there's so many benefits if we start shifting our diet, one, to the environment, and two, to our health. And actually the Lancet commissioned a study in this a couple of years ago, the Eat Lancet study, and it looked at it's called Food in the Anthropocene, and looked at how we would need to evolve and adapt our food systems globally to support our growing population. And it showed that eating whole foods, predominantly plant-based diet, is what we really need to be doing across the world, and reducing the amount of ultra-processed foods that we're eating too.
Wow, it's just been amazing finding out so much from you. I really thank you for your time. It would be remiss of us not to tell folks where to go to find the app, because I think I downloaded it as soon as I heard about it, and I think it's an amazing resource for folks. So where would we go?
Thank you. Yeah. So we launched on Earth Day to the App Store for Apple. So if you've got an iPhone, you can download that right now. And then we're actually going to be coming to Android later on in the year, and we're about to launch a crowdfunding campaign to help us bring an app to Android. So if you have an Android, you can sign up on our waiting list for news about that on our website, which is thefloopapp.com. And you can be first to try Floop when it comes to Android.
Awesome. Kayleigh, it's been amazing chatting with you. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully I'll be speaking to you again next time with some more of those amazing updates that you've got in the pipeline as well. So they all sound awesome too.
Thank you so much, Jim. I've really loved chatting to you too. So I look forward to chatting again in the future.